Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Argentina wash process Colombia from Prodigal Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Prodigal, based out of Boulder, Colorado. And this is their first ever appearance on this channel, and my first time trying this coffee roaster, as they are the brand new coffee roaster from well-known coffee consultant Scott Rao. And I originally didn't intend on reviewing them until I heard some feedback from others. But when I was up in Vancouver and saw this coffee at Revolver, it felt like the perfect opportunity to review them. Looking forward to discussing it, as this right here is day 35. And recipe we went with for this coffee is Scott's recipe, which is a 16.5 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 97 degrees Celsius, about 207 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this one is a little interesting, as it definitely came out a little bit more developed than I think I was expecting going into it. I would say a lot of people would align this with the more developed side of a medium light in terms of the roast profile. Not quite as developed as something like Onyx, but definitely a little bit more development than you might expect. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and that's actually the first note that I do have, is the coffee did come out a little bit more smoky than I think I anticipated going into it. However, there were a lot of lively fruits present both within the brew as well as the cup itself, as there was a pretty bright and lively mouthfeel with a candied stone fruit sweetness present within the cup from that first impression. So as a result, it definitely left a pretty solid start. Day 16, ran it through the Chemex, and the coffee continues to remain fruit sweet forward, as there is a very pronounced sugary stone fruit aspect, very much in line with the listed mango that they do have on here. In addition to that, they do have an apple note listed on here, and typically when I see that in coffees, I assume that it means there's going to be an apple-like brightness. However, this one also had an apple-like flavor profile to it, which was unique in its own sense. However, it did still have a fair bit of the smokiness, especially through the Chemex, so that seemed to accentuate a lot of the smoky characteristics, which is one of the main reasons I preferred the V60 for this coffee. So another positive day. We continue on to day 18, as we ran it back through the V60, and the cup feels like it is improving a little bit, though it is skewing a little bit more in the darker fruit directions, as there's still plenty of the apple-like brightness present within the coffee. Still a little bit of that smoky quality to it as well, but a very candied forward cup of coffee. Day 21. Ran it through the April dripper, and the coffee actually came out the most tame it had been up to this point, which was kind of interesting given the higher concentration we brewed it with. Fruit vibrancy feels slightly less defined, as the coffee is offering brightness and body without a particularly defined aspect to it. Just an okay day. We continue on to day 23, as this was the best day of the coffee to this point, as we adjusted to Scott's V60 recipe, and we were getting a lot more of this kind of apple juice-like quality present within the coffee itself. That's one thing I said earlier on, is that it had a little bit more of an apple-like flavor profile to it, which isn't something I traditionally experience with too many coffees. A lot more of the sugariness present within the stone fruit as well. While it is still slightly smoky, the cup just had a little bit more depth to it, and for that reason it was the most enjoyable it had been to this point. Day 26. Back through the Chemex, this time with Scott's recipe, and I just settled on the V60 being my preferred brew method, as the Chemex doesn't really seem to have the same sort of fruit vibrancy. Apple aspect, yet again on the forefront of it, complemented by a slight smokiness. Again, Chemex really seemed to accentuate that quality of this coffee. A bit more of the dark fruits as well, as that's where the coffee continued to trend, at least in terms of the profile to it. Day 29, best day of the coffee yet again, as adjusted once again to Scott's V60 recipe, and it yielded the cleanest and most vibrant results we had had up to this point, as it skewed multiple fruit directions, including that bright apple, slight candied stone fruit, but even a sweet Kenyan-like tart berry aspect, which I'm experiencing on this day as well. That seems to be the direction this coffee continues to trend with more time passing. Day 31, coffee feels like it might be on a slight bit of a decline, as the aroma and the overall vibrancy are slightly decreasing. So one of the first things I noticed from this coffee the first time I ground it and brewed it is that there is a very lively fruit aroma to it. However, with a little bit more time, that definitely seemed to dissipate ever so slightly. It has been pretty consistent overall, candied fruit aspects with a slight bit of brightness and a little bit more of those dark fruit aspects. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a bunch of level 4s, so let's go through those real quick. We will start with the body at a level 4. yes, this one had a lot more texture than I think I might have expected going into it. In hindsight, maybe that's something that should have been expected given that this coffee is a South American coffee. We preferred the V60 on this one, so in theory it would have a little bit more body to it. I think maybe a little bit more development might have helped that as well, so pushing that up to a level 4, yes, definitely had a little bit more mouthfeel texture than I think I had anticipated. Cleanliness, level 4. Not too much to say in that. Even with the smoky quality to it, there was still a lot of clarity within this coffee, so not too much to elaborate in that sense. Finish, level 4. Yes, that was actually one of the better aspects of this coffee, given that it left a very lasting kind of sugary fruit finish to the cup. So that right there, very much in line with the expectation of that level 4. Not too much to say on that. Sweetness, level 4. I think that's one of the best things I can say about this coffee is that it definitely came out a lot more fruit sweet than you might have expected for something like this going into this coffee. It had such a strong aroma to it from the grounds and the brew that you would hope it could translate into the cup. And for the most part, I was able to get it to translate. So I'm really happy with that being there at that level 4 mark. Acidity, level 4. That might be one of the more interesting parts of this coffee as well, given that there was a fair bit of brightness throughout the entire time drinking it. And even with a little bit of smokiness to kind of contrast that, I found it to be kind of unique that it was able to give us both of those factors within this coffee and still a lot of the fruit vibrancy to it. So yeah, I very much agree with that being right there. And then we have 2 level 4s in terms of the fruit aspects and the citrus at the level 4. And I always align the apple in terms of the citrus note in this tasting wheel because it's kind of the best way to put it. And yes, that was one of the most pronounced characteristics to this coffee. If anything, I would say it was the most defined and consistent flavor throughout the entirety of drinking it. It's maybe on the earlier days, it was a little bit more of a lighter stone fruit aspect. And then towards the later days, it was a little bit more of a kind of dark berry aspect to the coffee. So that right there was the most consistent aspect. So stone fruit definitely justified a level 4. I could say, yeah, mango maybe on the earlier days. Then I could probably think of some other things like some plums on later days. But nonetheless, plenty of stone fruit within this coffee. Definitely feel that's justified at that level 4. A couple of level 3s. We'll start with the berry. And as I mentioned, these later days seemed to yield a lot of these Kenyan-like qualities to it. These darker berry aspects, and for that reason, I definitely see that being there at that level 3 mark. I wonder if that's kind of what they mean by the syrupy quality, because yeah, it had a little bit of texture, but in addition to that, it had a little bit of this dark sweetness to it as well. Caramel, level 3. I think that's because this coffee was roasted with a Probat. It did have this candied sweetness to it as well, and that's why it was as high as it is. And then we have quite a few level 2s, but I don't think any of them are necessarily worth focusing on too heavily. Maybe the smokiness, which on earlier days could be pushed as high as that level 3. I was really wondering if this coffee had as much development to it as I think I remembered when I was brewing it today. And that seems to be the case, as it isn't necessarily as light as I might have expected going into it, but the smokiness, I feel like towards the end, with some adjustments and a little bit of time, went all the way down to level 2, so I'm happy with it being there at that mark, and I think for the most part, I'm happy with the way that this tasting wheel looks. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I feel like there isn't too much that can be taken away from this one for a number of reasons. And the first thing I wanted to say is that this is kind of like a test run for this coffee roaster for a couple of reasons. They're using a Probat for this coffee for right now, but they're going to be switching over to an IMF. And it sounds like when they do that, they're going to be going a little less developed in terms of the roast profile. So in a way, this is a little bit of a collector's edition coffee and a collector's edition review, because this isn't the way Prodigal is going to be in the future. It's just kind of maybe a way of getting their feet wet and trying some coffees. But in addition to that, it's also a little difficult to get too much from this, given that this is a wash process Colombian coffee, and it's a very safe coffee. So there have been so few washed Colombian coffees that I haven't enjoyed. This one right here had some really nice qualities to it. Of course, I'm going to point towards the sweetness, a lot of the fruit aspects to it. And in addition to that, it was complemented nice by having a fair bit of body to it as well, which isn't my biggest priority, but given that you are nailing the clarity, the sweetness, and the fruit aspects to it, I enjoyed it, even if there was a little bit more development than I typically go for in terms of my coffees. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I actually think I have a pretty good fit for this one, because this one right here feels like American coffees from maybe 5 years ago, before there's been so much experimentation to it. It has a lot of the great clarity aspects to it, with a lot of the vibrant fruit sweetness to it as well. So all of that encompassed with this more, we'll say, traditional American roast profile to it, because this feels like a lot of the coffees in terms of the profile itself I had from about 5 years ago, before things either started to skew in the very light direction or in the slightly more developed direction. This is kind of that middle ground that we used to experience from a lot of these coffees. I think for the most part, I'll leave this review at that. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything from Prodigal, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the La Argentina Wash Process Colombia from Prodigal Coffee. Thank you for watching.